What's happening, y'all? Welcome inside the Fantasy Stock Exchange. Bush coming at you solo today to basically break down the entire running back position from the 2021 fantasy season. Now, the fantasy season is now over. I hope you guys took home the gold. That trophy behind me is not going anywhere because I went back-to-back in my league, and I hope you guys won your leagues as well. These next 2 weeks or so of the content that we're going to be doing is going to be reflective in nature. We're going to be looking back on the season, looking back at some of our takes, our lessons learned, reviewing some of our calls that we made and stuff like that. And also, early looks at next season. That's what we're going to be doing the next 2 weeks. And it starts today with this video. Basically what I'm going to be doing in this video, I'm going to be reviewing the league winners at each position series that I did back in June, July. If you guys recall, if you were following the channel back then, I did a 4-part series basically outlining the anatomy of a league winner at each position from 2020 to 2014. And I looked at their volume-based factors, their carries, their targets, their touchdowns, and also their situational factors. So their team wins, points, offensive line play, quarterback play, all that stuff kind of went into the fact that I was digging into the running back position, specifically in this video. This one's about running backs. So today I'm basically going to outline who did it this year. Who was that league winning running back? I'm sure you guys all know who it was, but how could we have seen this coming and how can we use it to judge running backs in the future? Because that's really what it's all about, right? The reason we do reflective content at the end of the season is so that we can learn from what we, did right and what we did wrong in the preseason to make sure that next year we have more Jonathan Taylor on our rosters. Next year we have more Cooper Kupp on our rosters and all these guys that ended up being league winners. That's what our goal is. That's how we become better fantasy players. I know I've done this every single year, and I think I'm a better fantasy player today than I was last season and 2 seasons ago, et cetera, et cetera. So before I dive too deep into this, we're going to hit the intro and then we're going to get right into it. So like I said, who is the next league winning running back was the title of the video that I did back in June. And in that video, again, if you guys have watched that video, if you haven't, I encourage you to go watch it and see, what I fucked up and what I did right. But at running back, I defined a league winner as a running back who averaged 20 half PPR points per game with a minimum of 12 games played. Now, remember, I always use points per game for analysis. I do not use overall finish because it favors those who played 16, 17, whatever games that they played. I always use points per game because in those games that player was out, he was not in your starting lineup. So on a per game basis, who were the best running backs in fantasy? That's what we want to know. 20 half PPR points per game. Also, I used half PPR for 2 reasons. It's my preferred format, number 1. And number 2, it balances touchdowns and receiving work. So in a full PPR format, you got to imagine that the anatomy of a full PPR RB1 is probably more so leaned heavily towards receiving backs than it is in half PPR, where you can get there via touchdowns and a number of other ways. And like I said, it is my preferred format for fantasy football. So this is basically what it spit out. Again, when I did that exercise way back then, the volume factors that we want to look for running backs that could potentially be league winners are all on the screen right now. 2013 to 2020, these are the running backs that finished with half PPR points greater than 20. These were all the, league winning seasons. 2019, Christian McCaffrey, 2013, Jamal Charles, 2017, Todd Gurley, all these seasons that probably won a lot of you guys championships if you've been playing fantasy that long. These are all the volume factors that we talked about, right? Their carries, their targets, receptions, total touches, touchdowns, all that stuff was very important to analyze and know that, hey, if we can't feasibly think this running back that we're analyzing for next year is going to get, the 18 carries that he's going to need to be a league winning running back, can he make it up in some other area via efficiency, via touchdowns, via receptions, whatever the case is? That is what we needed to diagnose for each of these players. And I did the same thing with situational factors, because situational factors are equally as important, right? Because we've seen running backs like Alvin Kamara in 2017, his rookie season, for example, be one of those league winning running backs. And in 2018, he was the same thing, but he didn't do it because he got 20 carries a game. He did it because he got, he was highly targeted and he was in a great offense with a great offensive line, great run blocking, etc. Great quarterback. They scored a lot of points. He was very efficient in his own right. There's a number of different ways that you can get to this elite league winning running back status. So again, there was just one this year, and I'm sure you guys all know it was Jonathan Taylor. And technically Derrick Henry would have also been above this 20 point per game threshold had he played the whole season or played at least 10 to 12 games, which is the minimum kind of threshold to make this list. But Derrick Henry only played 8 games. Of course, he was on a record setting pace, before that happened, but technically only Jonathan Taylor was the league winning running back this year. And again, as you guys can see, I have mapped out Jonathan Taylor's, volume based and situational based factors based on the averages of the guys that I talked about already, those seasons from 2020 to 2013. And you guys can see that Jonathan Taylor had a clear path to being an elite league winning running back. And this was, and you guys are going to see this in a second. I established this very clearly when I did this video back in June and July, because I was very on Jonathan Taylor. I had a lot of stake in him in best ball leagues. I had a lot of stake in him in some of my my own leagues as well. The path for Jonathan Taylor was very clear. He needed to get a lot of carries. He needed to score a lot of touchdowns, and he needed to be super efficient, because we knew that because Nyheim Hines is there, he's not going to get the requisite receiving volume. Now, as you guys can see on the right with the averages there, on average, those running backs from 2013 to 2020 averaged 6 targets per game. Now, some guys only had, 3 or 4 targets a game. Some guys had like 8, 9, 10 targets per game in Christian McCaffrey's case, but that was the general average of those, elite league winning running backs. And you can see that Jonathan Taylor fell well short of that expectation. He got some receiving work, but he did not thrive in that area. So he had to make up for it by being super efficient. As you guys can see, the green means that they were well above the average of those elite running backs. And for Jonathan Taylor, that meant he had to be very efficient. 5.5 yards per carry, 22 years old at running back. And obviously he had a top 10 offensive line. His team won 9 games as of right now. This is before week 18 that I'm doing this. And offensive ranking points per game, they were a top 7 offense. So that is exactly what Jonathan Taylor needed to become the league winning running back that he was. Now, these are the final running back standings. And again, we use points per game around here. I do not use final finish for a reason that it skews the actual perception of what that running back meant to your team, because if he was not on the field, then you didn't put him in your lineup. So using the overall finish doesn't make any sense to me. So these were the RB1s on the season. And I also listed the reason for why they were RB1s. And I think this part is crucial. This is the most important part of this entire video. When we're evaluating running backs next year, we need to define their path to RB1 status clearly, because you do not need everything to be perfect, right? Jonathan Taylor was as good of a running back this year as we've seen in the last couple of years. He has been every bit the league winning running back that you guys drafted or that you guys traded for at some point this season, but he was not perfect, right? He did not have the receiving work. He was not a guy that was getting, elite carry volume. He was getting like 18, 19 carries per game on average. You do not need to be perfect to be an elite league winning running back, but you need to have a clear defined path to become that running back. You don't need, 8 receptions a game, plus an elite offense, plus an elite offensive line, plus you get 20 plus carries per game, plus you average 5.5 yards per carry, and everything about you is great. You break away all these big runs and stuff. No, you just need one defined, clear path. It's when you can poke holes in a player's outlook where you don't see a clear defined path for them to become an RB1 that you need to be worried. And that's what I saw with CEH this past year. For example, you guys, if you're following this channel, know that I did not like CEH as a draft pick in the early second, mid second, late second round area that he was going. And the reason I didn't like him was because there was no clear defined path for him to become an RB1. He wasn't getting elite receiving work. He wasn't getting goal line work, even despite the offense that he played in. I had a lot of concerns about Clyde Edwards-Helaire as a talent as well. So he didn't have a clear defined path to become an RB1, which is why he didn't finish as an RB1 this year. And in fact, he barely finished as an RB2, despite where you drafted him. And speaking of the RB1s, in terms of like ADP, if you guys were curious where these guys were going, 9 of these players, as you guys can see on the screen there, were drafted in rounds 1 to 3. And most of them were drafted in the top 15. The only guy that was drafted in like the 3rd round was DeAndre Swift. The rest of these guys, Jonathan Taylor, Austin Eckler, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, Najee Harris, Nick Chubb, Dalvin Cook, and Ezekiel Elliott. These guys were consistently like 1st round picks, if not early 2nd round picks at minimum. That is where you could have gotten these guys. And the other guys that finished in this area, Leonard Fournette, James Conner, both came from like ambiguous backfields in great offenses. And they came in that area of ADP round 7 to 10 area, where a lot of us, like myself, were attacking these guys in best ball drafts. So that is the real key thing here. If you're not going to, like, again, you guys can see there is 0 dead zone running backs on this list. We talked about the RB dead zone going into the season. There was 0 dead zone running backs on this list, right? Not Darrell Henderson, James Robinson, all these guys that were going in rounds 4, rounds 5, round 6 did not come in as RB1s to end the season. And that's for a reason. Again, there's a reason we avoid the RB dead zone. It's because you generally get RB2 production, which is very replaceable. And again, I talked about these guys' primary reason for finishing as RB1s, and it takes multiple avenues, right? For Jonathan Taylor, it was high efficiency. And, obviously his God-given ability. Austin Eckler, it was due to touchdowns. Same goes for Joe Mixon and Leonard Fournette, James Conner, Ezekiel Elliott. Those guys scored double-digit touchdowns, and that's why they finished as RB1s. For Alvin Kamara, for DeAndre Swift, it was because they were getting 5, 6, 7, 8 targets per game. For Najee Harris and Dalvin Cook, it's because they were carrying the ball 20, 22 times per game, and they were never leaving the field when they were on it. So again, there is multiple avenues to finishing as an RB1. I also have the RB2s listed here that I'll kind of just gloss over. Again, I listed the primary reason for them finishing as highly as they did. For Aaron Jones, it was because of receiving work and receiving touchdowns. Specifically, Damian Harris, he scored a lot of touchdowns on the ground. Elijah Mitchell, David Montgomery, Josh Jacobs, Antonio Gibson, James Robinson, these guys were all volume plays. Darrell Henderson was also kind of like a volume play, but he was also just elevated by his offense in general. And then we had Javonte Williams, Melvin Gordon. These guys were highly efficient. And then same goes for Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Darrell Williams, as I said, for Darrell Henderson. So again, RB2s were more diverse this year. 6 of these guys came from the first 4 rounds. And we see a little bit more of these dead zone running backs like Josh Jacobs and Darrell Henderson and James Robinson fit into this area. But again, the Broncos running backs, Damian Harris, Elijah Mitchell, and Darrell Williams, all these guys kind of exemplify the fact that you can get RB2 production simply by attacking ambiguous backfields later in your drafts, like you would have done with the Broncos backfield, or you would have done with the 49ers backfield, and a good offenses or a strong commitment to the run, right? Because the Broncos were not a good offense this year, but they ran the ball like crazy. Same goes for the San Francisco 49ers. They run the ball like crazy. Same goes for the Patriots. They ran the ball like crazy. So again, attacking these ambiguous backfields in good rushing offenses is usually always a good idea if you're looking for running back depth or RB2 production, whatever the case is. So going back and looking at what I did before the season, I think is the really important part here. And again, this is kind of an accountability check for me, because I'm sure you guys want to know, what were my predictions coming into the season? How much did I get right? How much did I get wrong? Because that obviously, says a lot about my credibility. So here were the predictions. And again, all on the line here. All of these factors help me establish a ceiling and floor for certain players. And again, when you change your mindset to map out what a ceiling actually means, because we hear that term thrown out a lot, right? Whether it's from me, whether it's from other analysts, you're going to hear somebody say, this guy does or doesn't have a top 5 ceiling. But when you don't actually know what that means, or the path that it takes you to get to that ceiling, right? I can say next year, for example, that Antonio Gibson has a top 5 ceiling, and you guys can choose to either believe me or disagree with me. And as long as I can map out why I think Antonio Gibson has a top 5 ceiling, his path to a top 5 ceiling, then I think it's valid analysis. When you just simply say, this guy doesn't have a top 5 ceiling because I don't think he does, that's not a valid answer. So again, you become a much better fantasy player when you really map out the path that a player needs to take to achieve that level of ceiling. And again, I'm going to show you exactly what my predictions were coming into the season. You watch that What Makes a League Winning Running Back video, then you guys are knowing what's about to come right now. But basically, these were the volume projections in terms of what I saw for these guys' ceilings and what I saw for their range of outcomes from a volume perspective. And again, I'll get into the situational stuff in a second. Now, I did this back in June and July, so you can just ignore Cam Akers and J.K. Dobbins, because obviously they got injured after I did this, so their information isn't really relevant. But I think the biggest takeaway for me is that the top 7 running backs I evaluated quite well, right? From a volume standpoint, I think I was pretty accurate in my expectations. Christian McCaffrey was obviously going to be heavily involved from a volume perspective, especially in the receiving game. Dalvin Cook and Derrick Henry were going to carry the ball like crazy. Saquon Barkley, when on the field, was going to be heavily involved in all facets of the game. Like I said with Jonathan Taylor already, he was going to be a guy that got his primary value from carries. Alvin Kamara from targets, and then Ezekiel Elliott also from carries. So the top 7 running backs in ADP from last year, I do think that I evaluated these guys quite well. The problems came in after that, right? And A.J. Dillon really ate into Aaron Jones big time. He was a guy that I really liked. I really liked Aaron Jones at the point in the draft that you were getting him. And the reason I really liked Aaron Jones was because I thought he would benefit a lot from Jamal Williams leaving in the target department. Basically, the 11.4 carries per game that Aaron Jones finished this season with was something that I actually kind of expected to happen. 11.4, 14 carries per game, that kind of range that Aaron Jones would have been in was what I expected for Aaron Jones. But the problem came in, Jamal Williams departed for the Detroit Lions, and Aaron Jones only had 4.33 targets per game, which is about on par with his career average. He was a guy that was consistently getting about 4 targets per game. And I thought that might jump to 6, 7 targets per game, which is why I liked Aaron Jones a lot more than he ended up finishing. So that was kind of a miss on my part. Aaron Jones finishes the RB13 in points per game. So he wasn't terrible, but he wasn't a guy that helped you win a fantasy league if you took him in the first round or in the second round or whatever the case is. Joe Mixon, of course, you guys know this was a big miss for us. From a situational perspective, this is why we missed, though. From a volume-wise, I think we were pretty accurate, right? As you guys can see there, I had questions about his targets and his receptions outlook because a lot of people were touting him as a true 3-down back who was going to get all this receiving work with Gio Bernard now out of the picture. I didn't think that was necessarily going to happen. It didn't happen, but the situational factors are what led Joe Mixon to finishing as a top 3 running back in points per game. And the reason I was too low on him was because I was too low on the Bengals offense in general. And I really love Joe Burrow coming out of college. I thought he was going to take some adjustment coming back from his ACL tear. So that one was on me. That is why I missed on Joe Mixon, because Joe Mixon's path to RB1 production was touchdowns. And obviously a big contributing factor for rushing touchdown volume is how good is your offense. And Joe Mixon's offense was a top 10 offense this year. So that was a miss on my part. Again, he only finished the season with 3 targets per game. So I was right from that perspective, but I was too low on Joe Burrow. I was too low on the Bengals offense as a whole. And that's why I missed on Joe Mixon. And it definitely hurt me in best ball leagues, in, regular season long leagues, whatever the case is. Moving on to Najee Harris. Obviously I underestimated Harris's volume a little bit in my projections because I didn't think he was going to get elite receiving volume, but 5.63 targets per game is borderline elite numbers. And that was definitely solid for him. So I was a little too low on Najee Harris from a target perspective, but I did have a decent amount of Najee Harris in best ball leagues and things like that. So I wasn't low relative to my exposure to him. Antonio Gibson, again, a guy that I probably missed on, I would say, definitely underwhelmed, but I do think injuries were the reason why, because anytime we saw this guy on the field not dealing with something, he was a volume, magnet. He was a guy that was getting 28, 30 opportunities per game at some points in the season. And I think if he comes into the season next year with a clean bill of health, then we're probably talking about a guy that is a good post-hype sleeper for us to talk about and could potentially win people leagues next year. So again, Gibson came into the year this year with a turf toe injury and a number of other things that he was dealing with, got injured to his shin early in the season. And a lot of, pro football docs and stuff said that his shin injury was going to linger throughout the season, which is definitely what happened. So Gibson is a guy that I think I'm going to be going back to the well to next year. Just not a guy that maybe I want to invest in as heavily as I did coming into this season because he has struggled to stay healthy to some degree. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, like I already said, I was dead on him. The volume wasn't consistent for him all season. I was all the way out on Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I didn't have a single share of him. I probably drafted him 0 times, even in best ball. This was just a guy that I was completely willing to be wrong on. And thankfully I was right on him. So that was something that was definitely something I did right. I actually did this exercise before I ended up rising on DeAndre Swift. You guys know, if you followed the channel in July and August, I was very high on DeAndre Swift, as was Danny. If I had did this exercise later in the offseason, I probably would have been higher on Swift's target potential because I kind of undersold that area of his game in these projections. So if I had done this in July, August, I would have been a lot higher on DeAndre Swift from a target perspective. And that's something that I definitely whiffed on at the time, but I definitely corrected that before the season started. So no harm, no foul there. Some of these other running backs, Chris Carson, Miles Sanders, they had numerous red flags. So I'm glad I stayed away from those guys. Didn't have a single share really in best ball or season long leagues of those two guys. David Montgomery never had that league winning ceiling, but I did like the volume and it was pretty easy to project for me. So he was a guy that I ended up with a decent amount. Now, here are the situational factors. Again, I already kind of talked about it to some degree with Joe Mixon. He was a guy that I was just wrong on the situation. The offense was a lot better than I thought it would be. The one guy that I need to address, because I'm sure a lot of you guys drafted him at my advice because he was my RB4 coming into the season and my 4th overall player on my board, was Saquon Barkley. I was too high on Saquon Barkley. Him and Joe Mixon have to be my 2 biggest misses, probably of the running back position for sure. Not that I didn't recognize that Saquon Barkley had risk, because I knew the ACL tear and the injury stuff was a risk as well. But the problem with what I had, the risk that I didn't take into account as heavily as I should have, was the situational factors. And again, the polar opposite of Joe Mixon's case, I basically said that the Giants offense was the best offense that Saquon Barkley has ever played in this year, right? I thought the offensive line was improved. I thought Kenny Golladay would make some contributions. They drafted Kadarius Toney. Of course, they still had Slayton and Sterling Shepard and Evan Ingram as tertiary pieces. I thought this offense was going to be a lot better than it was. It was one of the worst offenses in the league, right? So their offense was so bad. I don't know how I thought they could be good at the time. I don't know why I thought they were going to just suddenly turn a corner. That one was on me, and Saquon Barkley killed me in one of my redraft leagues. I drafted Saquon Barkley 5th overall, and I finished nearly in dead last in the entire league because my team was terrible. So Saquon Barkley definitely personally killed me. I'm sure he killed some of you guys that drafted him as well. So I definitely apologize for that one. But again, I'm going to use that going forward and become a better fantasy player because of it. So if you guys enjoyed this video, again, I really, really love making videos like this. These are my favorite videos to make. Macro game theory, not just player to player analysis. I love looking back on the season, reflecting on what happened, what factors led to, certain players outperforming what I expected, underperforming what I expected. So if you did enjoy this video, you want to see more, I am going to be doing this for sure for wide receivers and quarterbacks, probably not for tight ends, just because I don't really like talking about tight ends a whole lot. But if you did enjoy this video, please hit the like button, comment any of your thoughts down below, and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Check out the links in the description for all of the offerings that we have. We have fantasy football consultations available that you guys can check and fill out a form for. If you guys want some dynasty advice or whatever the case is, you guys can book either me or Danny to do a fantasy football consultation with you. You guys can check out our Patreon as well. We are going to be firing that up hot and heavy in the next couple weeks, because that is where basically what our draft guides were last year. We're going to turn into our Patreon going into this season. And then again, if you want to become a member of the channel, hit the join button on the Fantasy Stock Exchange YouTube page. You'll get access to priority response to comments and emojis and badges and all that kind of stuff. So definitely appreciate all you guys. Peace out, and I'll talk to you soon.